Peter's done this presentation before, so it's going to be highly polished, I'm sure. I'm encouraged. I'm not putting any pressure on Peter, but I've got confidence in Peter that this is going to be one of our better presentations. So Peter's got a huge background. He used to be a guide at one point. He started paddling back in the 70s up in Idaho. A vast experience, many rivers he's listed there. With great appreciation to Peter, I'll turn it over to him and let him continue with his presentation tonight. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So just a little bit of further introduction. I'm a water quality hydrologist by training. I moved to Idaho in 75, and the Middle Fork is one of the first trips I did. And it's a special place in terms of there's no better place to experience high water quality or natural hydrology. It's a natural river, and there's very few like it. In fact, it was one of the statutory designated rivers under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 68. That was largely due to Frank Church. He was senator of Idaho during the 60s. And frankly, he used the Middle Fork as a model for wild and scenic rivers. And I'm hoping that there may be some of you who have not done the river, looking at the people who are attending. I think most people probably have. But this will be a presentation that's geared for both people who've never done anything with it, and also it's tailored for people who want to do something. In fact, the presentation is densely packed with far more information than anyone could endure in a single night by design. It's intended to be a resource for people considering a trip down the Middle Fork. I expect it to be uploaded to the website so people can use it as a resource. It's got a lot of useful links, and I hope it will be useful. But tonight, I hope people can enjoy the pictures and be inspired by them and bring back good memories for those of you who have done it before. So some introductory details. So what is it? It's a 104-mile free-flowing river through the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness in central Idaho. That wilderness is the second largest wilderness in the lower 48, consisting of 2.35 million acres. But that's actually the largest contiguous wilderness, because the one that is bigger is Death Valley, and it's not contiguous. So, and it's also adjacent to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, which is 1.3 million acres. And the two are only separated by a 100-mile, one-lane wide, 60-foot wide dirt road corridor. So that's the only thing that separates the 3.6 million acres. So that part of Idaho is wild country. Between the two of them, the two wilderness areas are roughly the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. So the trip is 104 miles, is basically 100 rapids. Most of those are rated class 3 to class 4. The trip starts at Boundary Creek, elevation 5,700, and it finishes below the confluence with the main Salmon at an elevation of 3,000 feet. So the average gradient is 26 feet per mile. And by comparison, the Grand Canyon's average gradient is 8 feet per mile. Okay, so the Middle Fork proper starts at the confluence of Marsh Creek and Bear Valley Creek. That confluence is about 6 miles upstream from the Boundary Creek launch site. So the total length of the Middle Fork is 112 miles. And of course, the first 6 miles you don't normally do. The watershed area is 2,870 square miles. There isn't a single dam in the entire watershed. So it has a natural hydrograph. It flows as nature intended. It's all wilderness. There's no permanent occupation. There is a seasonal lodge at the Middle Fork Lodge. That's at River Mile 33. And that's the location of the USGS gauging station, which I'll explain a little bit later. There are 5 primitive airstrips along the river. Those were grandfathered in. There's a long history of backcountry aviation in Idaho. And in fact, actually, the Indian Creek airstrip is actually very important to the people who run the Middle Fork. The others are used primarily by private parties. So the Middle Fork was one of 8 designated wild and scenic rivers under the 1968 Act. It was basically, okay, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was sponsored by Frank Church. He was a long-serving senator from Idaho, and he was both instrumental in the Wild and Scenic Act as well as the Wilderness Act. And in fact, that's why it's the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, because he was so instrumental. But the significant thing is, under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the Middle Fork was the model for wild and scenic rivers across the country. So, and incidentally, we've got 2 of the original 8 done under the 68 Act in New Mexico. The wilderness section of the Chama and the Rio Grande south from the Colorado border. They were both designated in the original act. All subsequent wild and scenic rivers have been approved and designated through subsequent acts of Congress. So the river's got multiple climate zones, starts in an alpine forest, goes through a high mountain desert grassland area, and it ends up in a steep walled canyon. The canyon is actually the 3rd deepest canyon in North America. The second is the main Salmon, and that's where the Middle Fork drains into. And the deepest is Hell's Canyon, and that's what the main Salmon drains into. So these are spectacular canyons. So the Middle Fork's an internationally recognized whitewater wilderness float trip. People from all over the world do it. It's known for its scenic beauty and crystal clear whitewater and many other things. It flows through a geologic formation called the Idaho batholith. That's a granitic intrusion covering about almost 10,000 square miles, roughly the size of the state of Vermont. That's a chunk of granite, 200 miles long and 75 miles wide. It's massive. It's not like most of the mountain ranges in the Mountain West. Normal mountains kind of have a north-south orientation. The Idaho batholith is massive. It does not have an orientation like that. And it's no sedimentary rocks like what you see in the southwestern desert or the Colorado Plateau. So here's a map that shows the aerial extent of the Idaho batholith, and the Middle Fork is in this area here. And this is kind of an oblique aerial view. So again, you can tell that that's not a normal basin and range mountain structure. So again, it was intruded about 80 to 100 million years ago into rock that was about 1.5 billion years old. It was uplifted 50 to 65 million years ago. And interestingly, at the time that the uplift started, it was pretty horizontal. It was pretty level. And so as a result of that uplift, all of the mountains pretty much peak out at the same same height. So here's a view, a little different view from the ground from a hike up one of the drainages. So the topography, as a couple slides previous to this shows that it's relatively narrow V-shaped valleys, steep side slopes, and relatively narrow ridge systems. The significant thing about this is the average slope is 45%. That's a 1-to-1 slope. For every foot of horizontal, it rises a foot vertical. So it's steep. And that's one reason I'll get into later, one of the problems it has with wildfires and blowouts. Okay, so the Middle Fork is also rich in cultural values. It was occupied by native tribes, the Shoshone and the Nez Perce, up until 1879, when the U.S. Army drove them out in the Sheep-Eater War. There's evidence of trappers, miners, and homesteaders, and there's still a fair amount of artifacts there, but it's basically largely untouched by human activity. So there's a USGS gauging station at Middle Fork Lodge. That's at River Mile 33. If anyone's talking about water levels on the Middle Fork, they're always going to be referring to the gauge height at the Middle Fork Lodge. And typically, if it's under 2 feet there, it's really low water to launch at Boundary Creek, particularly for rafts. Kayaks, and actually late season, people actually use open canoes, but they can manage the upper part, but typically it's not recommended under 2 feet. And then low water is anything under 3 feet. The sweet spot is between 3 and 5 feet. High water is considered 5 to 6. And it's continuous flow, so it doesn't have a lot of eddies. So if you're doing it at high water, you need a strong group, and you should have a group that's familiar with the river. And anything over 6 feet, the Forest Service does not recommend travel. So here's a table relating discharge or cubic feet per second for gauge height. Again, you're not going to remember these numbers, and the numbers are only relevant for that specific location at Middle Fork Lodge. But the significant thing here is the peak was in 1974. It peaked out at a little over 10 feet, and that was almost 21,000 feet, 21,000 cubic feet per second. So again, that's mile 33 out of 100. So by the time it got to the bottom, it was chugging. And in fact, the Maine salmon topped out that year. I think it was over 120,000 at down by Riggins. So big water year, and very significant. Okay, so again, one of the reasons why trying to say that you floated the river at a particular discharge is there's like 60 named creeks between Middle Fork Lodge and the bottom of the river, and some of them fairly significant, including Loon Creek, Canvas Creek, and Big Creek. So again, the gauge is only useful in terms of discharge measurements for that specific area. But if you say that you did the Middle Fork at 4 feet, people are going to know what that, at least people who've been here before and are experienced with it will know relative what that's like. It's not like doing a day run like on the Rio Grande, where you know what the flow is, and the flow, because you're doing such a short run, that flow is throughout the whole length of river that you're doing. But the Middle Fork is like a 6-day trip over 100 miles. So it starts off as a little stream and ends up as a big one. Okay, so this section is going to get into a little bit of the geography. So where is it? Okay, it's in Idaho. And this is where Idaho is. And it's in central Idaho. So this green area here is basically where the Middle Fork is. And I'm going to describe the main salmon because the Middle Fork is a significant tributary, but the Salmon River is it's important for context. So the main salmon is 425 miles long. It's the longest free-flowing river in the country. The watershed area is 14,000 square miles. So that's bigger than the combined states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. There's only 12,000 people in the whole watershed. So it is not, it's very sparsely populated. And of course, most of it is wilderness. Total relief is about 9,700 feet. The highest point is in the Sawtooth, 10,007, and it drops to a little over 900 feet at the confluence of the Snake River. So the biggest tributaries of Middle Fork and the South Fork. And it has a section that was designated wild and scenic in 1980. That stretch begins where the Middle Fork trip ends. And it takes out upstream of Riggins on the other side of the state. So here are the main tributaries. These are upstream tributaries, of course, the Middle Fork, and then downstream of the Middle Fork is the South Fork, and the Little Salmon. So here's a map showing the tributaries. This is the main salmon. It starts here. This is Galena Summit. That's the drainage divide north of Sun Valley, Idaho. This is south of both the main salmon and the Middle Fork is the Snake River drainage, and that goes down into the Snake River plain. But interestingly, the Snake River basin is present on the other side of the divide at the top of the river, but the river also ends up in the Snake River. So, but the Snake River is really big. It goes across the whole state, starts in Yellowstone Park, goes through Teton, comes into the state over here and crosses the Snake River Plain and becomes the border between Idaho and Oregon near Payette. So here's a view of the Salmon River at the first point where the state highway crosses it as you're coming down from Galena Summit. So it's pretty small and nondescript. Here's at the confluence with the Snake River at the other end. So this is actually the Snake River here, and this is the salmon coming out of the canyon. So Middle Fork now I'm going to be talking about the Middle Fork. So it starts in the Sawtooth Mountains. As I said just previously, south of the headwaters is the Snake River Plain section. On the east of the headwaters is the main salmon. And actually, this is a picture of the main salmon. This is the berg of Stanley, and this is the east side of the Sawtooth. On the west side of the headwaters would be the Payette River. And then on the north side of the Sawtooth is a drainage of the Middle Fork. And again, this kind of shows shaded relief. The main and the Middle Fork start up here. And this is near the northern edge of the Snake River Plain. Snake River Plain is really flat for anyone who's ever been there. So this is the general location of the nearby wilderness areas. Again, central Idaho, well, it's an exaggeration to say it's one big wilderness, but that's not that far of an exaggeration. Okay, so this is the Middle Fork. This is a satellite view of the headwaters at the confluence of Marsh Creek here and Bear Valley Creek here. And again, this is like 8 to 10 miles upstream of the put in at Boundary Creek. And this is the other end. This is the confluence with the main salmon. This browner water is the main salmon, and this is the mouth of the canyon known as the Impassable Canyon. So you can see the difference in the water quality between the Middle Fork and the main. Okay, why? Why would anybody want to do this? Here's some attributes about the river. So 100 rapids in 100 miles. It's basically mostly class 3 and a fair number of class 4. But the significant thing is there's no slack water. It's constantly moving. It's fairly steep at top. The first 25 miles, the gradient is 40 feet per mile. The remainder averages only about 23 feet per mile. So in low water, that first 25 miles upstream of Indian Creek can be pretty bony and quite challenging. In high water, it's not bony, but it's super challenging because there's no eddies. It moves like a freight train, and it's not that hard as long as you can control your boat. But if you flip, it's easy to get in trouble. If you flip, you're in trouble, period. Okay, another attribute. It's an unspoiled wilderness that's, about as scenic as it gets. So it starts out as a small technical alpine stream. This particular shot is at First Bend Rapid, which can be seen from the boat ramp, the launching site. And I'll show you a different picture of this that also shows you what the boat ramp looks like. But as you see, it's small, it's technical, and it's completely doable for anyone who has control of their boat. It's not that tough, but if you can't control your boat, it's going to be really tough. So this is kind of symptomatic of the middle part. Grassy slopes with trees, fairly open. And the lower section, steep walled canyon. Again, it's the 3rd deepest canyon in North America. This picture is a little exaggerated. I played with this picture a little bit, so it's not quite as exaggerated as that. But again, it's the 3rd deepest canyon in North America. Okay, so it's got remarkably clear water. I've never been on a river with any clearer water. And it's certainly a whole lot clearer than anything in New Mexico we paddle. So it's got plenty of wildlife, all kinds of big game. You don't need to read this, but there's plenty of it there. And there's a good chance you're going to see some of this. You're not going to see mountain goats and mountain lions, but bighorn sheep are very common. And you're probably not going to see the wolf, but river otters, you can see a fair number of those. I've seen them on several occasions. It's got great fishing with salmon runs. This is a raft that you see there's no oars on it. This is called a sweep boat. The guy running it is standing up, and he's got these two big, well, paddles or oars or whatever you call them. But the Middle Fork and the main salmon are about the only rivers that this type of boat can be used on, because you don't use the oars for propulsion. You use them for moving side to side on the river. So all they're doing is dancing side to side, and they're letting the current carry them. So it's a treat to see these boats on the river, and you're only going to see them on the Middle Fork and the Main. They have a long cultural history of these boats. So the Middle Fork has a terrific fishery, lots of different species of fish. It still has two anadromous salmonids, Chinook salmon and the steelhead trout. They'll spawn in the Middle Fork. They'll travel down Middle Fork, Main salmon, snake, and Columbia out to the ocean, and then they do their spawning runs. They reverse the trip. They're tough dudes because there's a lot of dams in the way, and the current salmon runs are a very small percentage of the historical runs. So the river has a very wide range of natural flows. This is a graph of 10 different years. And essentially, it's never the same river. Every time you run it, it's a different river. And if you were to launch the same day of the year for 10 consecutive days, 10 consecutive years, it would be a different level every time. And that it's a natural flow regime, snow melt driven, and it's one of the beauties of it. It's free flowing and undammed. So why do the river? It's got several hot springs right along the river. When you're assigned camps the night before your launch, as I said before, there's actually I haven't said that yet. There's 7 launches per day, 4 privates and 3 commercials. And the night before the trip, you meet with a ranger to decide who gets what camps. It's a round robin. Everyone gets their first camp, and then once everyone has selected their first one, then the next one gets to do the second. So, but each group gets to stay at one of these 5 campsites. And frankly, I think that my favorite by far would be Loon Creek. So, here's the Loon Creek hot spring. It's actually, you have to walk from the campsite to get up there. This is actually Loon Creek. So this is upstream of the confluence with the Middle Fork. But, and this is Sunflower Hot Spring. You can get a shower here. No soap in the water. The water is really clear. It's as clean as you're going to find anywhere in nature, and you don't want to pollute it. Okay, so how do you get on this thing? Okay, it's controlled by permits. The permit control season is from May 28th to September 3rd. If you want to try and run it outside the permit season, you can do it. You still have to register with the Forest Service, but you don't really have any competition. So there's 10,000 users per season, 7 launches per day, 4 private, 3 commercials. So that translates between May 28th and September 3rd. It's just under 400 private permits issued during the control season, 392. So here's the website for getting the permits. The permits, the lottery covers 4 rivers in Idaho managed by the Forest Service. Middle Fork, of course, the Main salmon, Selway, and Hell's Canyon. So the application period is December 1st through January 31st. Lottery results are posted mid-February. Deadline to confirm your permit is mid-March. Odds of winning are about 2%. So again, there's just under 400 permits issued. This is an not particularly clear graph, but these darker blue lines are the number of applications for permits on the Middle Fork. So significantly, it's over 20,000. And again, there's less than 400 permits issued. So likelihood of success, this is the odds of getting a permit. Basically, it's going to be, in recent years, it's going to be between 1% and 2%. So if you want to do the Middle Fork, you may not be able to do it on a private permit unless you know somebody, unless you're good friends with someone who is lucky. So access, it's access, the primary main season access is the Boundary Creek Road, which takes you into the Boundary Creek launch site. And that's off State Highway 21, just west of Stanley. Once you leave the state highway that's paved, you got 26 miles of dirt road. And oftentimes you can get in before June, and oftentimes you can't. Kind of depends on the snow. So there's a hazard in picking late May, early June. If it's a big snow year, you may not be able to get in which case you either fly into Indian Creek, or there are some people who will put in at Marsh Creek. That's directly off State Highway 21, but it's a really small log jam creek. It's quite technical, and there's a drop right before the Dagger Falls. Dagger Falls used to be a place where people would put in, but and actually the first time I did it in the 70s, we actually launched at Dagger Falls, but the launch site was moved to Boundary Creek. But Dagger Falls is a class 5 rapid, and if you put in on Marsh Creek, you better plan on either portaging it or running a tough rapid. So again, the Boundary Creek access really isn't useful for low waters, gauge height less than 2 for rafts. Although oftentimes people will deadhead, and that means the main trips, people on the trips will fly into Indian Creek, but one person on each boat will launch at Boundary Creek, and they'll struggle their way to get down to Indian Creek. You got one day to do it, and that's going to be a really long day because, I did it one time when I was rowing a gear boat for ARDA, and I think the river was like maybe 1.6, and you're basically looking the beach on one of the best wet rocks. You're going to be pulling and dragging. It's not a lot of fun, and the commercial operators will not put customers in that situation. It's just the diehard guides that get to do that. And sometimes the Boundary Creek Road will be closed during fires. I think it was when I did it in 2003, I was retrieving I left my car at the launch site and almost couldn't get back into it. The road was closed west of the dirt road due to a fire. It hadn't closed yet all the way into Boundary Creek. So I was able to get my car out of there, but I didn't hang around long enough to find out whether or not they closed the road after I got my car out. But fire is a potential danger for access, and you're gonna, there's likelihood that you're going to run into fires while you're on the river. Okay, so here's a shot of the ramp at Boundary Creek. That earlier shot that I showed you of First Bend Rapid, that was right here. So air access, that's at the Indian Creek Airstrip, which is at River Mile 25. It's the low water site, although some commercial outfitters will launch there in high water, and that's to avoid the first 40 miles, 40 foot per mile for the first 25 miles. Again, if the Forest Service recommends not launching above 6 feet, but there are people who will launch 7 or 8 feet, and the consequences of doing so can be severe. And again, the main problem is if you flip, it's very challenging to recover a boat. Probably isn't, well, I was on a trip in 05. One of the guys flipped a boat. It wasn't even in a rapid, but somehow he flipped it in, just moving water. And we didn't catch it until there's a big eddy about less than a couple of miles above Pistol Creek. And so as a general matter, the river isn't that hard, but there's really tough consequences if you're in a raft and you flip it. It's really tough. Okay, so this is a pilot's view of the Indian Creek Airstrip. This is a boater's view of the beach at Indian Creek. This is obviously low water. It's a very busy place. As I said, there's 7 launches a day, even in the low water season. So this is a very active place. Okay, so the takeout is at Cache Bar. That's 3.4 miles below the confluence with the Main. It's 70 miles from Salmon, which is where a lot of commercial trips will leave if they're putting in at Indian Creek. North Fork is where the river leaves the main state highway. If you go straight on the highway, you go up to Missoula, Montana. But once you leave the state highway, you've got 47 miles on the Salmon River Road, which is open most of the time. There have been times when rock slides will close it. Again, you kind of have to be able to deal with adverse conditions. This is wild country, and things don't always fall into place as you hope that they would. So here's a view of the takeout. This is a view from upstream on the river, and this is a view from the road. You'll notice here evidence of smoke. I'll get into that a little later, but Idaho has a tendency to have a lot of wildfires, and this is an area that's very much subject to them. Okay, so transportation. So this is, again, how do you do this? The shuttle from Boundary Creek to Cache Bar is basically 10 hours round trip. So you got to better plan on how you're going to do that. There are commercial shuttle services available. You can get people to shuttle your cars for you. You can get vans. And here's a listing of several outfits that will do that for you. If you use a commercial service for your private trip, it's going to be several hundreds of dollars per car. Okay, so if you can't pull a private party permit, there is the commercial option. And again, they get 3 launches per day, and they know ahead of time. They probably know for not only the 2025 season, they probably know what launch dates they have for the 2026 season. So the dates are predictable. And obviously the advantage of commercial operations is that they take care of all the details. All you have to do is write them a check. They take, they've got the experience, expertise, equipment, food, and they'll take care of the shuttles. It's a sweet way to do it if you don't have the means of doing it yourself. So here's a list of all the operators. There's plenty of them. Okay, so I'm talking the commercial option, transportation. So people from all over the country fly in to do commercial trips on the Middle Fork. And most of them will fly into Boise. And there's several flight operators that operate out of Boise, and they'll fly you to, Stanley, Idaho is typically a meeting place for commercial trips that launch at Boundary Creek. Salmon is typically the meeting location for Indian Creek launches. So these operators can fly you to Stanley or Salmon. Their charter services, you have to make arrangements ahead of time. Okay, so Indian Creek charter flights, if it's low water, you better plan on doing it. These are bush pilots. They're very experienced, but as you saw from the photo from the pilot's view going into Indian Creek, the experienced pilots don't have any problem. But I would not take a flight into Indian Creek with someone who hadn't done it before, who had their own plane, said, "Oh yeah, I can fly you in there." Don't do it. It's not worth it. Okay, and again, sometimes they use Indian Creek launch for high water. So if you're going into Indian Creek, commercial trips, they'll take care of that. They'll coordinate your flights, and all you have to do is follow instructions. If you have a private trip, you have to go into Indian Creek, you have to work that charter out yourself. Okay, so what's it like? Okay, so here's a little bit of eye candy. But before we get to that, here's a description that one of the outfitters use on their website. And I kind of like the language, so I'll actually read it. This is how they describe the upper section. Intricate and intimate, as the creek-like stream cascades over rocky ledges and winds through an evergreen forest. Here's how they do the middle section. Describe it. Open and arid with longer vistas of expansive hillsides and isolated stands of giant pines. Pretty accurate, actually. Lower section, awe-inspiring as the river cuts through the impressive rocks of the impassable canyon. Here's a couple more, not specific to the regions of the river, kind of talking about the whole river. So the Whitewater is amazing, not just in difficulty, but also in consistency. The whole river is like a continuous frolicking riffle interrupted by a couple of noteworthy pulse cricketers. The water itself is stunning, gin clear. You can see fish swimming around at the bottom of a 20-foot deep pool. And frankly, every one of these descriptions is accurate. Okay, so what's it like? It's popular. There's 7 launches a day, and this is kind of what it looks like. Most people will rig the night before, rig most of their stuff, at least get the boats down there. And it's congested. However, the river is 100 miles long. So once you launch, you're not going to, you'll see other parties occasionally, but it's a true wilderness experience. It's managed that way. That's why they only allow 7 launches a day, why there's only 10,000 people on the river for the entire control season. So, but it is popular. And the statistics on trying to pull a private permit reveal that. Okay, so again, clear water, and this is another shot from the launch ramp at Boundary Creek. So it starts off as a tight, the upper part is a tight alpine stream. At one time it was forested. This is actually a picture of Velvet Falls, which is, I think, somewhere around mile 5. This is the way it was when I did it the 3 times in the 70s. And I've got later shots as to what it's like now after the recent burns. But so it starts off in places, it's still forested up on the upper part, but a lot of it's burned out stubs of trees. So, you know, there's occasional riffles and mellow spots, but even in the mellow spots, it's moving right along. So it's technical, but the reality is, if you can control your boat, I've never found it particularly difficult, but I don't have any trouble putting the boat where I want to. Yeah, it's bony when it's low, particularly in the upper spot. Okay. I don't know whether you can tell or not, but this guy is not, he's standing up in the water trying to get his boat through a place where the boat doesn't have the ability to get through on its own. So again, the upper stretch in low water, this is what you're going to run into depending on how low it is. So there's no shame in hitting rocks up there because you know, maybe if you have a kayak, you might be able to avoid hitting rocks, but even then, I'd be surprised you could do that. But, you know, any real raft in low water up there, you're going to be pulling and dragging the boat. This is more typical. You know, there's places you can go through here, but, you know, all right, it's shallow here. One of the tricks is to keep your rafts relatively soft so you can slither over it and anticipate where you're going to ground out and get some momentum so that your momentum will carry you over the wet rocks. Okay, fires. Lots of fires. Okay, so this is an illustration of fires for the whole state of Idaho. This is just between 1950 and 2012. This is where the Middle Fork is. You know, I'm not sure there's any place in the Middle Fork that hasn't burned at least once during white man's occupation since the Idaho territories, let's put it that way. And a lot of areas have burned multiple times. And it's kind of a myth thinking that if you're in a burn area, an area that's burned recently, that it's not going to burn again. Not true. That's happened here, and I've got experience in Colorado where I lived up until 2.5 years ago, where, you know, some places will burn multiple times. So I found this out. The source of this information is the State Water Quality Department of Environmental Quality. They were doing water quality assessments called total maximum daily loads, which is not relevant to people who aren't water quality hydrologists. But in part of that report, in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, is an average of 95 wildfires per year. 88% of them are lightning caused. Now, most of the 95 are suppressed to be less than an acre. But the average, the major fire springs, the average up to 60. And if you look at the statistical distribution, the vast majority of these 95 per year are really small. But you can have some really big ones too. And it's not uncommon for fires to exceed 100,000 acres. Okay, so here's some satellite shots. These were from Google Maps taken last fall. So, okay, so here's the Boundary Creek launch site. This is all recent burns. You know, that dark spot, that's all burnt out stubs. This has been thinned out. This has been burned. This is burned, that's burned. This is a small drainage that before this area burned, it was inconsequential. It was just a little trickle that flowed occasionally. And as a result of some fires, I'm not sure, the fires probably since the year 2000, but in 2002 and 2003, there were significant intense rain events which caused significant slides or debris flows. And this is actually the course of a significant debris flow, and it impinged on the river here. And again, these upper watersheds, yeah, they've been burned over. You may remember the slide a ways back where I said the upper part is a alpine forest. That was this area here. This is what used to be an alpine forest. It's been substantially burned. And when it burns, obviously you lose the vegetative cover. The vegetative cover helps intercept rain as it comes down, slows it down so it doesn't have as much impact on the ground. Erosion is the process of dislodgement of material and transportation of material. In a forest, the vegetation will intercept the precipitation and calm it down so you don't, it doesn't get it detached as much as it does in the burn area. And then, of course, lots of these soils, after they've been burned, will become hydrophobic. That means that they do not absorb any water. You pour a little bit of water in the soil, and it just runs off like it's concrete. And right up until the point where the velocity increases to the point where the velocity is strong enough to carry the sediment, and then it just accelerates downslope until you get a major blowout that comes down to the bottom of that comes down to the river. So here's a closer version. This is at Sulphur Slide Rapid at mile 2.5. So this is real close to the launch site. Again, this is a result of a blowout in 2023. And this is satellite imagery that I picked up last fall. So, all right, so here's a big debris fan. So that's, that's how the river has changed. So this is a almost a river level view. This is that lush alpine forest that we saw in an earlier slide. And this is the debris that came down that relatively small drainage. That drainage probably isn't more than 1.5 miles long, but keep in mind the average slope here throughout the whole watershed is like 45 degrees. So you put rain on a slope like that that's been burned, and you have hydrophobic soils. This is what happens. So this was actually downstream of that particular blowout. And you can see here that a big pile of logs that came down the debris flow. The river washed them out. There's not a lot, they're not all muddy now, but obviously they're blocking the flow. And at this time, the time that this aerial photo was taken, the river was closed from Boundary Creek to Indian Creek. And anyone who wanted to do the Middle Fork, they had to fly into Indian Creek, or that was the only option. Either fly there or don't do the trip. So this is a close-up view of what those what the log jam looks like. And obviously you're not going to want to try and get through this. And again, this is kind of what the burn area looks like. Another view of burn area. Now, you may remember I said that the river is continuously flowing throughout its entire length. If you look closely at this picture, this is a lake. This is backwater. There's a debris flow here that's jammed up the river. So if you're running the river and you come across a lake, you can pretty well rest assured that there's going to be something damming up the flow downstream, and you better be prepared to pull out and take a look at it. Okay, so this is the debris that caused that backwater from the last slide. So this is Velvet Falls. This is the blowout that occurred August 23rd. And this is a flight taken shortly after that, while the river was still closed. So the debris flow came down. Okay, so you can see a lot of burnt trees here. And off the slide to the right is the steeper part of that particular drainage. And, the trees fall down. They get washed into the stream channel, and the stream channel is probably more debris than it is water, but it still has enough water in it to lubricate it, so it slides down the hill and makes it into the river. Okay, this is the same blowout, and this is a satellite view. The last one was a low airplane aerial view. Okay, so this is the old Velvet in the alpine forest area. Again, this is roughly about 5 miles down from the launch site. So this was the first really significant rapid on the first day of the trip, any trip. And a lot of people would scout it, but people who were familiar with it, they knew that the run was over here. River runners left. So this is what it used to be like. And this is what it would be like in higher water. The hole in Velvet is serious enough that, particularly at this level, you want to avoid it. Obviously, this person is riding it out. Probably not intentionally. Okay, so this is New Velvet. It's much narrower. It's been constrained seriously from the river right side. There's still a fair amount of trees over here, but the blockage has cleared up. And here's the boat that ran it, and it's the same boat. So it's fairly decent water going through here. You don't really want to, you want to stay upright through here. Okay, so this is the New Velvet at low water. So this is the rock that was making the hole that the prior guy decided, well, whether or not he decided or not, he went into it. Okay, so the middle section, yeah, grassy hillsides with occasional trees. Kind of more of the same. More of the same. But it's never gets boring. It's delightful all the way. More of the same. This is a hot spring. It's probably Sunflower Hot Spring. The campsite for this one is across the river, but it's still a camp, which is very enjoyable to use the hot spring. Okay. Yeah. I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. So this is an aerial view of the middle section. More people having fun on the Middle Fork. Okay, so this is the lower canyon section in low water. It's really nice. You can tell it's low water because you can see the rocks. You can see how this lower part of this cliff is a lot lighter in color than up here. That's because at high water, this is the high water line. And when the water is that high, it's carrying sediment, rocks, and it's polishing the color right off the rocks here. So when in high water, all this stuff is buried and the water is at this level. Okay, more shots of the canyon. And again, you can kind of see the high water mark. A place like Hell's Canyon, which is dam controlled, the high water mark fluctuates because of water releases for power generation. At least here, the high water mark is natural, and that's one of the beauties of it. Okay, more lower section canyon. In low water, yeah, you got some maneuvering to do. In high water, okay, so here's a contrast between low water and high water. Again, this is the high water line. These are not the same locations, but it's big water. The canyon is big water when the water is high. Another contrast between low water in the canyon and high water. Okay, so here are the credits. I borrowed pictures big time from all of these sites, probably a few others. As long as it's probably okay for fair use on the trademark copyright laws. If you're going to use any of this stuff, I don't care whether or not people use my pictures or anything. Just don't try and make money off it, because then you run afoul of copyright laws. And this is a guidebook that I highly recommend. When I first got to Idaho in the 70s, they had a much older version, much smaller version. But it's a very comprehensive guide. It tells you the history, explains, shows maps with campsites and rapid names, and a very interesting book. So, any questions?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat, but one of them is, what's it cost to fly into whatever it is for the put-in if you can't get in at the normal put-in?
Okay, I don't know, and the reason for that is it's completely variable on how much stuff you're flying in. If you know you're flying in, go light. Most people, when they're on a raft river trip, they carry everything but the kitchen. Well, they carry the kitchen sink. If you load up with lots of stuff, it's going to be really costly. But quite frankly, I don't know what it costs per plane. I did a Maine salmon rowing trip in September of 23, and the flight from the other end, from the west end of the Maine salmon back to Salmon, I think was like 141 weight. And that was with a maximum of 35 pounds of gear. So that's as good as I can do as to what the cost of that would be.
And then a couple people asked, well, other questions were, what's it like outside the permits season after September 3rd and before May 28th? Is it worth even going?
If you're in a raft, probably no. If you're in a kayak, there's people who do self-supported kayak trips. And that's doable as long as you kind of have a backpacker's mentality. When I was in Idaho, I knew people who would do early season trips in high water. They'd put in at Marsh Creek. And what would normally be a 6-day trip, the water was so high they did it in 2 days. So I did 120 miles in 2 days, and it was a wild ride. So probably the best thing to do would be to talk to someone who's done it. If I wouldn't recommend it, particularly from New Mexico. It's a really long drive, but and particularly if you've done it before, do it while the water's nice.
We happen to have somebody in our club, Russ Cooper, who grew up in Idaho, and he was part of a fraternity kind of sort of fellas called the Salmon Boys. And he can tell you all about it. He's still got his parents live up there, and he can tell you all about the Salmon River area.
Yeah, there's a lot of people up there who, well, okay, the last time I did a raft trip, the permit holder was from Boulder, where I was from, but she had a lot of people in Idaho. Basically, they worked at the Idaho National Engineering Lab out of Arco in Idaho Falls. Those guys had run it hundreds of times, and they would run it out of season, mostly before the season, and particularly if the water was high, peaked early, and the snow was good enough so you didn't have to worry about getting into Boundary Creek. So yeah, Idaho people can, they know it well. The people that I did it in the 70s when I was kayaking, yeah, they knew it like the back of their hands. And back then the permits were relatively, well, actually the permits only came in, I think, in the early 70s, maybe like 72. And those 3 years I was in Idaho, I got the group that I was with pulled permits every year, and I even pulled one. So, but I think the secret there was having a zip code with an Idaho zip code. That helped.
I used to
And
follow.
I'm curious, you showed some drift boats. Anybody do it in wooden drift boats, Mackenzie boats, anything like that, or is everything a balloon boat?
Yeah, there are people who run dories. You see a lot more of those on the main salmon. And it kind of depends on the level. If you're doing the middle fork, at the sweet spot between 3 and 5 feet, the dories work fine. Again, as long as you know how to avoid rocks, that's the big thing. If you can control your boat, it's not a problem.
If you're running the middle or the main salmon, you've even got the option of jet boats. You can jet up or jet down.
Right.
Depending on the flow. It's expensive, but that's an option as well.
Right. Yeah, the shuttle on the main salmon is 10 hours one way. So if you drive it, most commercial trips will terminate the trip with a flight out of McCall.
I know my parents are on the call tonight, but one of their favorite trips, they can go up there and spend 28 days on the salmon. They put in near Salmon, Idaho, and float all the way down to Riggins, or not Riggins. Riggins would be the end of the main salmon, but they continue on through the lower salmon if they can stack permits. And if you're retired and you go to the put in and standby, a lot of times you can pick up cancellations next day.
Yeah. People who, yeah, there are cancellations, last minute cancellations. And if you're ready, if you're sitting at Boundary Creek ready to go and there's a cancellation, you can do it.
What a great presentation.
Awesome,
Peter.
awesome.
Thank you, Peter.
Oh, my pleasure.
Ours
I love the
too.
Middle Fork. I love talking about it, and I enjoyed putting this thing together. You kind of reconnected me to it.
Anybody gets permit, call us.
Yeah, yeah.
Likewise.
Actually, that's how one of the times I actually had a time where I had to choose between working a Grand Canyon motorized trip or doing a Middle Fork, and I chose the Middle Fork. And of course, you know, if I was working a motorized trip, I'd be baggage, and but rowing the Middle Fork, you know, that's an absolute delight.
So Peter, can you put in specifically for the Middle Fork, or is it part of the Four Rivers lottery system? I heard that changed recently.
It's all part of the same lottery, and it's been a long time since I've done it. But I think you have multiple choices, and I think, at least in the past, you could use up all your choices on the same river. And you know, the Selway is part of that, and the Selway, they only allow one launch per day, and that includes the commercials. So the likelihood of getting a Selway permit is pretty low. But again, when I was in Idaho, I did the Selway 3 years in a row, and one of those years I pulled the permit myself. So things have changed since the 70s.